The night Jacob Lawson rode into Caldwell County with a tin of kerosene and a match was the night he discovered that the past has a way of surviving even the most determined man's attempt to bury it. He had ridden hard from Dodge City, 3 days without proper sleep, living on jerky and black coffee, and the particular kind of cold resolve that settles into a man when he has made a decision he cannot unmake. The year was 1878, and the Kansas plains were baking under a late September sun that had not yet agreed to give way to autumn. The grassland stretched out in every direction like a tawny sea, and the sky above them was the sort of deep, bruised blue that comes just before full dark, when the last ember of sunset has been swallowed by the horizon and the first stars are still deciding whether to show themselves. Jacob was 31 years old, lean in the way that hard work and harder times make a man lean, with dark eyes that had seen enough to make them cautious, and hands that bore the particular calluses of a man who had spent his life split between ranching and the occasional work that men in desperate positions take on when the cattle prices drop. He was not a bad man. That was the thing he kept telling himself over those 3 days of riding. He was not a bad man, but he had done bad things, and there was a ledger out there with his name in it, and if that ledger survived, he was finished. The ledger was not a real ledger, of course. It was a collection of letters, documents, and what his former employer Harlan Briggs had called the evidence. A wooden crate of correspondence and financial records that documented a cattle rustling operation Jacob had been tangled up in 2 years prior. He had not been the architect of it. He had been what you might call a willing instrument. A man who had moved cattle from one county to another without asking enough questions, who had accepted money without examining its source closely enough. When the operation collapsed, and Harlan Briggs rode south toward Texas with a marshal on his heels, he had left the crate of documents at the old Garner homestead on the edge of Caldwell County, claiming it was the safest place to store anything because nobody went near the Garner place anymore. Florence Garner's family had left that homestead 2 years ago, Harlan had told him. Old Silas Garner had died of a fever, his wife Martha had gone to live with her sister up in Wichita, and the daughter, Florence, had married some fellow in Abilene and moved away. The place was abandoned. Harlan had ridden out there specifically because it was abandoned, because the roof had started to cave in on one end and the well had gone dry, and not a soul in Caldwell County would think to look at a derelict homestead for anything worth finding. That had been 2 years ago. And now the marshal's office in Dodge City was getting closer to connecting the dots, and Jacob had been told by a man he trusted that the documents in that crate were enough to put him in a federal prison for no fewer than 5 years. So he rode. He rode through 3 days and 2 nights across the Kansas plains with his kerosene and his matches and his cold resolve, telling himself he was not a bad man, but also knowing that a man who burns evidence to save his own skin is not exactly demonstrating the finest qualities of his character. He smelled the homestead before he saw it, which surprised him. There was wood smoke on the air, thin and domestic, the kind of smoke that comes from a cook fire, not a burning building. He pulled his horse, a gray gelding named Cassius, to a slow walk and stood up a little in his stirrups to look ahead through the gathering dark. The Garner homestead sat at the end of a rutted track that wound between 2 low rises. The main house was a 2-room structure of weathered timber and sod, with a lean-to kitchen built off the back and a stone chimney that was, at this precise moment, producing a thin pale ribbon of smoke that rose straight up into the windless evening air. There was a light in the window. Not a lantern left burning, but a real, deliberate, warm light that spoke of habitation. Jacob drew Cassius to a stop and sat very still in the saddle, looking at that light for a long moment. His plan, which had seemed so clean and simple across 3 days of empty plains, suddenly had a complication in it that he had not anticipated. Someone was living here. He dismounted slowly, looped Cassius's reins around the gatepost of a fence that had mostly fallen down, and walked toward the house with his hand nowhere near his gun, because he was not that kind of man, even when he was doing the wrong thing. He knocked on the door. There was a silence inside. Not the silence of an empty house, but the specific silence of a person going still, listening, deciding. Then a voice came through the door, low and steady, with the kind of steadiness that is not natural ease but a practiced composure. "Who is it?" It was a woman's voice. Jacob had not been expecting a woman's voice, and for a moment it knocked him entirely off his prepared approach, so that he stood there in the cooling dark with his hat in his hands and his mouth slightly open before he collected himself. "My name is Jacob Lawson," he said. "I am a traveler from Dodge City. I am sorry to disturb you at this hour. I was expecting this property to be unoccupied." Another silence. Then the sound of something being moved inside, a scraping sound, like a chair being shifted. He noted that she did not immediately open the door, and he respected that. "What is your business at an unoccupied property?" the voice asked. He stood in the dark with that question hanging over him, and had the distinct sensation that this woman was smarter than the situation he had prepared for. "I have a connection to a former resident," he said, which was the nearest truth he could offer without explaining everything. "I left something here some time ago." The door opened. Not all the way, just enough, and the woman on the other side of it held a cast iron skillet in one hand and a candle in the other, and she looked at him with a pair of brown eyes that were doing rapid and precise calculations about whether he was dangerous. She was, he noted with a shock that he did not allow to show on his face, genuinely and arrestingly beautiful in the uncomplicated way that has nothing to do with fashion, and everything to do with the particular quality of a person's attention when they are focused entirely on you. She was perhaps 25 or 26, with dark auburn hair that had come partially loose from its pins after a day of work, and she was wearing a plain cotton dress that had been mended at the collar and the hem, and she had flour on her left wrist from whatever she had been doing before he knocked. "Florence Garner," he said, and then realized he had said it like he knew her, which was the wrong note entirely. She went a little more still. "How do you know my name?" "Harlan Briggs mentioned you," he said, and watched her face change. It was not a subtle change. The name Harlan Briggs did something specific to Florence Garner's expression, something that moved through surprise and recognition and anger in about 2 seconds, and her hand tightened on the skillet. "Harlan Briggs," she said, "is the man who told half of Caldwell County that my family's property was abandoned and available for anyone to use as they saw fit. He is also the man who on 3 separate occasions tried to convince my father to sell this land at a price that was an insult to the timber alone." Jacob processed this. "You are still here," he said. "Harlan told me your family had left." "My mother left," Florence said. "My father passed. I came back." She said the last 2 words with a particular flatness, as if they were a statement of fact that did not require elaboration and did not welcome it. "Now, you said you left something here. What was it?" He looked at her standing in the doorway with her skillet and her candle and her steady brown eyes, and knew that the version of himself who had ridden 3 days across the Kansas plains to burn a crate of incriminating documents was going to have to reckon with the fact that this house had a person in it. And not just any person, but a woman who had apparently been here long enough to have a cook fire going and flour on her wrist, which meant she had settled back in. Which meant the crate was either in the same place Harlan had left it or she had found it. "May I come inside?" he asked. "No," she said, without hostility but with absolute clarity. "That is fair," he said. "Can you tell me if there is a wooden crate anywhere on this property, about so big," he indicated with his hands, "stored perhaps in the root cellar or the back of the lean-to?" Florence studied him for a long moment. The candle flame moved slightly in a breath of wind and made her expression flicker. "There is," she said. "I found it 2 months ago when I was cleaning out the lean-to. It is full of papers." I have not burned it yet because burning things requires intention, and I was waiting to understand what I was looking at. The air went out of him in a way that was not quite relief and not quite dread. "Have you read the papers?" "Some of them," she said. "Enough to know that whoever owns them has reason to want them destroyed, and enough to know that I should not be quick about destroying them before I understand what justice might require." Jacob stood very still in the cooling Kansas night with the stars coming out overhead, and the smell of her cook fire in the air, and the full weight of his situation pressing down on him from all directions. He had ridden 3 days to burn evidence. He had found instead a living woman who had already read some of it and had the moral clarity to think about justice before convenience. He put his hat back on his head. "May I sit on your porch step?" he asked. She looked at him for another long moment, recalculating. Then she stepped back and swung the door open wider. "Come inside," she said. "You look like you have not eaten properly in days, and I have a pot of beans on the fire, and you are going to tell me everything, because whatever Harlan Briggs put in that crate brought you to my door, and I think I deserve to understand why." He stepped inside, and she closed the door behind him. The interior of the homestead was small and clean, and full of the evidence of a woman determined to make something livable out of something that had been neglected. The hearth was swept, and a cast iron pot hung over a modest fire. There were 2 chairs at a wooden table and a shelf of tin cups and plates, and in the corner near the window there was a small writing desk with a stub of candle on it, and a book open face down on the surface. And Jacob noticed that the book was a legal text of some kind, which was not what he had expected to find in a 2-room homestead on the Kansas plains in 1878. Florence put the skillet down on the stove and ladled beans into 2 tin bowls without asking him whether he wanted them, because the offer had already been made and the decision was already taken. She set one in front of him at the table and sat across from him with the other, and she waited. He told her. Not everything, not all at once, but he told her the shape of it. He told her about working for Harlan Briggs's cattle operation out of Dodge City, about the money that had seemed clean until he started looking at the brands on the cattle and noticing inconsistencies, about the gradual understanding that he had been moving stolen livestock across county lines, about the morning Harlan vanished south, and the crate of documents appeared in the lean-to of the Garner homestead like a grenade with no pin. He told her that the crate contained letters that bore his name and his handwriting, and that would be very difficult to explain to a territorial marshal. Florence ate her beans and listened, and she did not interrupt him except once, when he described his role as essentially passive, as someone who had not known fully what he was doing, and she looked up at him from her bowl and said, "That is a comfortable story, Mr. Lawson. Is it the true one?" He stopped. He held her gaze. He said, "The true one is that I suspected more than I admitted to myself, and I took the money anyway because I needed it, and I told myself that was different from knowing. I am not sure it is." She looked at him for a moment that felt longer than it was, and then she nodded and went back to her beans. "That is an honest answer," she said. "I will give you credit for that." They sat in silence for a while, and the fire burned low and the night settled fully around the homestead, and the Kansas plains were quiet outside except for the distant sound of something moving through the tall grass, a coyote probably, or a rabbit. "What were you going to do with the crate?" she asked. "Burn it," he said. "And now?" "Now I am sitting in your kitchen eating your beans and trying to figure out what kind of man I actually am," he said. "Because I thought I knew the answer to that before I knocked on your door, and it turns out I was working with incomplete information." She looked at him then with something that was not quite a smile but was the near neighbor of one, a slight easing at the corners of her eyes, a fractional softening. "That is a surprisingly self-aware thing to say. You are a surprisingly unexpected person to find in an abandoned homestead," he said. "It is not abandoned," she said, and there was a sharp edge in it, not at him but at the idea itself, at anyone who thought that a place where a family had lived and worked and died could be called abandoned just because nobody was standing in it at the moment. My father built this house with his own hands in 1861. I grew up in this house. My father died in this house. It is not abandoned. It is just waiting. Waiting for what? She looked at the fire. For me to figure out what to do with it. He did not press her on that. He asked instead about the legal text he had noticed on the writing desk, and she told him she had been teaching herself land law because, when she had returned to the homestead 8 months ago, she had discovered that Harlan Briggs had filed a claim of abandonment with the county land office in an attempt to acquire the property at a minimum price, claiming the Garner family had vacated and left no heir in possession. She had spent the better part of 8 months fighting that claim from inside the house itself, writing letters to the county surveyor and the land office and a lawyer in Wichita whom she had found through her mother's cousin, living on what her kitchen garden produced and what credit she could get at the general store in the town of Morrow, which was 7 miles east. Jacob listened to all of this and felt something shifting inside him, not dramatically, not like a conversion experience, but slowly and steadily, the way the light changes in the eastern sky before you can see the sun, a gradual brightening that announces something significant is coming. She was fighting. She had come back here alone, and she was fighting a man who had the money to bury her in paperwork and the connections to make that paperwork dangerous, and she was doing it with a legal text, a stub of candle, and a cast iron skillet, and she had been doing it for 8 months without anyone to help her. The letters in that crate, he said slowly. Some of them are between Harlan Briggs and the land office. Florence set down her spoon. What did you say? When I was working for Briggs, there were letters. I never read them all. I never had reason to, but I remember Briggs dictating to his clerk, and I remember the county land office being mentioned in the context of a property acquisition that Briggs was pursuing. I did not know it was this property at the time. He looked at her steadily. If those letters are in that crate, they might be more useful to you than to me. The silence that followed that statement was a different kind of silence from the ones that had come before. Florence was very still, her brown eyes fixed on him with an intensity that felt like light through a burning glass. You rode 3 days to burn that crate, she said. I did. And now you are telling me it might contain evidence against the man who is trying to steal my land. I am. She stood up from the table and walked to the window and looked out at the dark Kansas night, and he could see her reflection in the glass, her expression, the way she was processing everything, and he waited because he understood that she needed a moment with this, and rushing her would be the wrong instinct. Why are you telling me this? She asked, her back still to him. He thought about it. He could have said something about justice, or about compensation, or about it being the right thing to do. But Florence Garner had already established that she was not a woman who would be satisfied with comfortable answers, and so he told her the truth instead. Because I knocked on your door expecting an empty house, and instead I found someone who deserved better than what she had been given. And because if I had burned that crate tonight, I would have been doing Harlan Briggs a favor, and it turns out I am a lot less interested in doing Harlan Briggs favors than I was when I left Dodge City. She turned from the window and looked at him for a long moment. You are still in the documents, she said. If we use those letters, they will see your name. I know. You could go to prison. I know that too. She looked at him with those precise, calculating brown eyes, and something in her expression settled. Not satisfaction exactly, but resolution. The look of a woman who has made a decision and is at peace with it. Sleep in the barn tonight, she said. I want to go through that crate again in the morning with fresh eyes, and I want you there to explain what I am reading, because you know these people and I need to understand the full picture before I do anything. He nodded and picked up his hat from where he had set it on the table. Miss Garner, he said at the door. Yes, I am sorry for what Briggs did to your family's land. And I am sorry for my part in any of it, however indirect. She held the door open for him and looked at him with a frankness that he found both challenging and, though he would not have said so aloud that night, quietly magnificent. "Don't be sorry yet," she said. "Be useful." He slept in the barn that night on a pile of hay with his saddle for a pillow, and Cassius watched him from the adjacent stall with the patient indifference of a horse who has seen his owner in worse situations. And the Kansas stars wheeled overhead through a gap in the roof, and Jacob Lawson lay awake for a long time thinking about the particular quality of brown eyes that do not flinch. In the morning, Florence was up before him. He could smell coffee before he fully emerged from sleep, real coffee, which was a small luxury in 1878 Kansas that required either money or careful rationing. And when he came into the kitchen rolling his sleeves down against the morning chill, she had the crate on the table and a tin cup waiting for him, and she was already reading, her hair pinned up neatly now and her expression concentrated. "Sit down," she said without looking up. "Tell me who Thomas Aldrich is." He sat down and accepted the coffee. Aldrich was Briggs's contact at the Caldwell County Land Office. He processed claims, recorded transfers, that kind of work. Briggs paid him to look the other way on certain transactions and to move paperwork faster than it should have moved. Florence set down the letter she was holding and looked at him with an expression that was simultaneously unsurprised and deeply tired. "So the man processing my abandonment claim is the same man Briggs had in his pocket." "Almost certainly." She picked up the letter again and read a portion aloud. It was dated March of 1877, and it described, in careful and businesslike terms, an arrangement between Harlan Briggs and Thomas Aldrich regarding the expediting of a land claim for a property described by its section and township numbers in Caldwell County, and it referenced a payment of $30, which in 1878 was not an insignificant sum. It was signed with Aldrich's full name, and it was written on land office stationery. "He signed it," Jacob said. "He signed it," Florence confirmed. "A man who thought the evidence was going to disappear signed his own name to a bribery agreement." Jacob felt something unfamiliar moving through him, something that took him a moment to identify because it had been a long time since he had felt it. It was the sensation of being on the right side of something. Not the convenient side or the safe side, but the right side, the side where the doing of a thing aligns with whatever a person believes they are actually for. They spent the rest of that morning at the table together, reading through the crate document by document. Florence organized them into piles, sorted by subject and date, with the precision of someone who had been teaching herself legal process for 8 months and had developed a genuine aptitude for it. Jacob explained the context for the cattle operation documents, naming names, identifying relationships, and occasionally stopping himself when he was about to explain something that put him in too favorable a light and correcting toward the more accurate version instead. Around mid-morning, she looked at him across the table and said, "You keep making yourself sound worse than you need to." "I keep telling the truth," he said. "The truth and making yourself sound worse are not always the same thing," she said. "There is a difference between a man who organized a cattle rustling operation and a man who was recruited into it under false pretenses and continued past the point where he should have asked more questions. Both are problems. They are not the same problem." He looked at her. "You are making a legal argument on my behalf." "I am making an accurate argument," she said. "I do not do legal arguments on behalf of people who do not deserve them. Now, is there anything in this crate that describes you as someone who gave orders, or is it always someone else giving orders and you confirming receipt?" He thought about it carefully and honestly. "Briggs gave the orders. I received and acted. My name is on movement documents and on a few receipts, not on any directives." "Then your exposure is significant but manageable," she said, and went back to her sorting with the matter-of-fact briskness of someone who has set a problem on a shelf to be dealt with properly in due course. "Now, let us focus on Aldrich." That afternoon she wrote 2 letters. The first was to her lawyer in Wichita, a man named Samuel Pryor, enclosing copies she made by hand of the most critical documents, including the Aldrich letter and 3 others that documented the land scheme. The second letter was to the office of the Caldwell County Circuit Judge, requesting a stay of the abandonment proceeding pending new evidence of fraud. Jacob watched her write the second letter and felt something occur to him. "You write well," he said. She did not look up. "My father believed that a woman who could not read and write clearly was a woman who could be cheated," she said. "He educated me the same as he would have educated a son. Your father sounds like a remarkable man." She paused in her writing just briefly, a single suspended moment, and then she continued. "He was," she said quietly. "He was not perfect, but he was remarkable." Jacob rode into Morrow that afternoon to post the letters, because Florence did not want to be away from the homestead, and she could not trust the documents out of her control. So she stayed, and he rode the 7 miles east with 2 sealed envelopes in his coat pocket, and the sense of having acquired a purpose he had not been looking for. The town of Morrow was the kind of small Kansas settlement that existed in 1878 by sheer collective determination rather than any particular geographic advantage. A main street of board-front buildings, a general store, a blacksmith, a telegraph office, a saloon that was also the hotel, and a land office which Jacob now regarded with a specific and personal animosity. He posted the letters at the general store, which also served as post office, and he was turning to leave when a man came out of the land office across the street and looked at him. The man was stocky and gray-haired, and wore the expression of someone accustomed to being the most important person in whatever room he occupied, and he looked at Jacob with the slight narrowing of eyes that means recognition without warmth. Jacob did not know him by sight, but he knew the type, and he knew from the land office door that this was probably Thomas Aldrich. He tipped his hat and kept walking. When he got back to the homestead that evening, Florence had made cornbread and she had cleared the table of documents, which were now carefully organized in a stack with a flat iron holding them down, and she set the cornbread on the table alongside the last of the beans, and they sat across from each other in the lamplight, and he told her about the man outside the land office. She went very still. "Did he recognize you?" "I don't think so. I was not working for Briggs in this county, mostly over toward Dodge. He would have no particular reason to know my face. But Briggs might have described you in correspondence," she said. "And if Aldrich has been watching this property for signs of activity, waiting for me to give up or make a mistake, then a strange man posting letters in Morrow and riding toward the Garner homestead is a thing he would notice." They looked at each other across the lamplight, not with fear exactly, but with the heightened attention of 2 people who have moved into a situation that has teeth. "How long does it take a letter to reach Wichita?" he asked. 3 days to a week, depending on the stage schedule," she said. "Samuel Pryor is efficient. If he receives it in good condition, I would expect a response within 2 weeks. And the judge?" "The circuit judge rides out from Emporia every 2 months. His next scheduled visit to Caldwell County is in 3 weeks. If my stay request reaches him before then, and if he grants it, Aldrich cannot move on the claim during that time. And if he doesn't grant it," she broke a piece of cornbread and looked at him steadily, "then I need those original documents in front of him in person," she said, "which means I need to be in Emporia in 3 weeks, which is 60 miles from here." Jacob looked at her. "You cannot travel 60 miles alone." "I am aware of that," she said. "I am also aware that traveling 60 miles with a man I met yesterday is a different kind of problem." He almost smiled. "What kind of problem is that?" "The kind that people in small Kansas towns with long memories talk about," she said, "which under normal circumstances I would care very much about, and under these circumstances I care about significantly less than I would like, because the alternative is losing my father's land." There was a silence between them that was full of something neither of them was ready to name yet, something that had been accumulating since she opened the door with a skillet in her hand and told him to be useful. It was the silence of two people who have spent a day and a night in close proximity with high stakes and discovered that the proximity is not uncomfortable. "I'm not going anywhere," Jacob said. "Not until this is settled. You came back here to hold onto your father's land, and I arrived here to destroy evidence that might actually help you keep it. I think the least I can do is see it through." Florence looked at him for a long moment in the lamplight. "Why?" she asked, and it was a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. He thought about it honestly. "Because you made coffee this morning before I was even awake," he said. "And nobody has done that for me in a very long time. And I think maybe I have been doing the wrong kind of work for the wrong kind of men for so long that I forgot what it felt like to sit across a table from someone and feel like the thing you are doing is worth the doing. And I would like to keep feeling that for a while." Florence looked away first. She looked at the fire, and then at the table, and then she picked up her cornbread and ate it with a precision that was partly composure and partly, he thought, an effort to contain an expression she was not ready to share. "You can sleep in the barn again tonight," she said. "I will not have the neighbors thinking anything untoward." "Of course," he said. "But tomorrow," she added, not looking at him, "I would appreciate it if you stayed." He slept in the barn again, and this time he fell asleep faster, and the Kansas stars were gentler about it. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that surprised Jacob with how naturally he fell into it. He was a rancher by original trade, and before Briggs had pulled him sideways he had been a good one, and the Garner homestead, whatever state it had been left in, was land that knew what it was for. He repaired the fence on the north side of the property that had fallen down in last winter's ice storm. He shored up the lean-to kitchen roof where it had begun to separate from the main house. He cleared and deepened the dry well with a borrowed auger from a neighbor 2 miles west, a quiet Mennonite farmer named Gerhardt Schell, who lent the tool without asking questions, and brought back with it a small basket of early apples from his orchard, because he had heard there was a young woman alone at the Garner place, and he believed in being neighborly. Florence accepted the apples with genuine warmth and baked half of them into a pie, and sent the other half back with Jacob when he returned the auger, along with a note of thanks written in her clear, precise hand. And when he came back that evening, she was standing in the kitchen doorway watching him come up the track, and there was something in her expression that was not quite the same as the expression she had worn when she watched him leave, and he noticed that, and stored it carefully. She was, he discovered over those days, a woman of considerable contradictions that were not actually contradictions at all, but simply the full dimensionality of a person. She was reserved in her emotions but absolutely clear in her opinions. She was practical to the point of severity in most things, but she read poetry. She had a slim volume of Tennyson on the writing desk that she read in the evenings after the legal texts had been put aside, and she read it with a concentration that suggested it was not merely decoration. She was funny, but in the dry, understated way of someone who has decided that life is too serious to take entirely seriously, a kind of humor that comes out sideways in quiet observations that catch you off guard. She laughed once in those first days, a real laugh, at something Jacob said about Cassius's opinion of the well water, and it was a laugh that opened her whole face up and lasted about 3 seconds before she composted herself, and he found himself spending a disproportionate amount of mental energy for the rest of that day trying to think of things that might produce it again. They talked in the evenings, not just about the documents and the legal situation, which had a natural urgency that structured much of their days, but about everything else. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about his father's small farm and his mother's determination that her sons would have more options than the farm had given his father, about the brother who had gone east to study medicine and the brother who had died at Chancellorsville in 1863, and the way that loss had flattened everything in his family for years afterward, a grief that lay under the surface of every conversation like a table they all agreed not to look at. She told him about growing up on this land, about her mother's roses that had been planted on the east side of the house, and had been neglected now for 2 years, and were coming back wild, about her father's belief that a person who worked hard and dealt honestly would be protected by the simple arithmetic of their own virtue, and about the way that belief had been tested and ultimately sustained across the particular indignities of homesteading in post-war Kansas. He really believed that? Jacob asked. The arithmetic of virtue. He believed it enough to stake his life on it, Florence said, and he was right in the end, or at least mostly right. The things that undid him were illness and age, not dishonesty, and I think he would have said that was a fair accounting. And you, he asked, do you believe it? She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the evening wind had come up and was moving through the grass with a sound like breathing. I believe in doing the right thing, she said carefully. I am less certain than my father was that it reliably produces good outcomes, but I think a person has to act as though it does, or else nothing holds together. Jacob thought about that for a long time afterward. He thought about the 3 days of riding with kerosene and matches and cold resolve, and about the way that a single lit window in a dark prairie night had changed the entire trajectory of whatever he was. He thought that Florence Garner was possibly the most morally coherent person he had ever met, and he thought that sitting across a table from her felt like standing in a doorway between two different versions of himself. On the 8th day after his arrival, a rider came from Morrow with a letter. Not from the judge, and not from Samuel Pryor in Wichita, but from Thomas Aldrich at the Caldwell County Land Office, addressed to Florence Garner and written in the precise, dry language of an official who is doing something aggressive and calling it administrative procedure. It informed her that the abandonment claim had been finalized and accepted, and that transfer of the Garner property to its new holder would be completed within 30 days unless she appeared before the county land office in Morrow with proof of continuous and uncontested habitation. Florence read it twice. Then she set it on the table and stood at the window and was quiet for a moment. Jacob read it over her shoulder, and when she moved to the window he stayed at the table and waited. 30 days, she said. Pryor can get here before 30 days, Jacob said. If Aldrich has finalized it, Pryor's letters may not be enough. She turned from the window. I need to go to Emporia and see the circuit judge directly. Before the 30 days are up, I need to put the documents in his hands. Then we go, Jacob said. She looked at him. You said we. I did. Jacob. She said his name with a particular care, as if she was aware of what it meant to say it that directly. If you come with me to Emporia and present yourself as a witness against Aldrich and against Briggs, your name is in the record. Whatever protection anonymity has given you is gone. I know. You could go to prison. You told me that already, he said. My answer is the same as it was then. You said you did not know what your answer was, she reminded him. I know now, he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and he held her gaze, and the morning light through the small window of the homestead made everything in the room look clean and possible in the way that morning light in late September in Kansas has a particular quality of grace, the way it falls level and gold across the plains without the heat of midday or the sorrow of evening, just a clear and honest light that shows things as they are. Why? She asked again, and it was the same question she had asked over the cornbread. Because you came back here, he said. When you could have stayed in Wichita with your mother and let Briggs take this land and nobody would have blamed you, you came back. And you have been holding on to this place alone for 8 months with a legal text and a cast iron skillet, and you are the most determined person I have ever encountered, and I would like to be useful to that if you will let me. Florence looked away. She looked at the south wall of the room, where there was a small framed picture of her parents on their wedding day, a photograph that had been taken in Emporia by a traveling photographer the year the family arrived in Kansas, and the two people in it looked young and serious and full of hope. She looked at that photograph for a moment, and then she looked back at Jacob. We leave Thursday, she said. They made preparations over the following 2 days. The documents were carefully wrapped in oilcloth and packed into a leather satchel that Florence had found in the back of the lean-to, a sturdy piece of luggage that had belonged to her father. Jacob rode tomorrow for supplies and came back with coffee and dried meat and flour, and a new length of rope for Cassius's lead. And also, on an impulse he could not entirely explain, a small bundle of ribbon from the general store's dry goods shelf, the color of burnt orange, which he left on the kitchen table without comment, and which he found tied into Florence's hair the next morning, a small precise bow at the back of her head that she did not acknowledge and he did not mention. The ride to Emporia took 4 days. They traveled at a steady pace, not punishing, and they camped at night with the kind of practical arrangements that traveling in the Kansas plains in 1878 required: a fire, a bedroll each, a watch kept in turns against whatever the night might bring. Jacob had his rifle and Florence had her father's old Remington revolver, which she handled with a matter-of-fact competence that told him she had been taught properly and had not forgotten. The plains were something in that late September light. The grass had gone gold and red at the tips, and the horizon was enormous in every direction, and the sky was the particular shade of blue that only exists over the Great Plains, a color that goes all the way up and has no ceiling to it. They rode mostly side by side and they talked, and sometimes they did not talk, and the silence was comfortable in the way that silence only gets between people who have decided to trust each other. On the second evening they camped beside a creek, and the sunset turned the water red and gold, and Jacob was collecting firewood when he heard Florence laugh, the real one, not the contained one. He looked up, and she was watching a jackrabbit that had emerged from the grass, and was regarding her with the complete bafflement of a small animal trying to determine whether she was dangerous, and she was laughing at its expression with her face fully open and her head tilted back slightly. And Jacob stood at the edge of the firelight with his armful of wood, and felt something happen in his chest that was specific and final, and that he recognized immediately for what it was. He put the wood down carefully, as if the moment were something fragile, and she caught him looking and immediately composed herself, turning back to the fire with a slight flush along her cheekbones that was visible even in the fading light, and he sat down across the fire from her, and said nothing about it because it was too new and too important to rush. But that night, watching the fire die down to coals, he turned the feeling over and examined it carefully from all its sides the way a man examines something valuable that he has found unexpectedly, and he found it to be solid all the way through, nothing hollow in it, and he kept it and was quiet about it. On the third day they crossed into Lyon County, and the plains gave way to a longer, gentler landscape with more trees along the creek lines and the occasional farmstead visible at a distance, and the sense that they were drawing toward the center of things, toward the settled east, away from the open frontier. Emporia came into sight on the afternoon of the 4th day, a proper town of several thousand souls with a courthouse and a main street long enough to have 2 saloons and 3 churches and a newspaper office and a women's school, the Kansas State Normal School, which had been established there in 1865, and which Florence regarded as they rode past with an expression that Jacob noted carefully. "You wanted to attend," he said. She glanced at him. "How did you know that?" "You looked at it the way a person looks at something they wanted and didn't get," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I was 17 when it opened," she said. "My father said the farm needed me. I think he was right. I think he was also wrong." "Both things can be true," Jacob said. She looked at him from under the brim of her hat. "You keep saying unexpectedly wise things," she said. "It is disconcerting." "I will try to stop," he said. "Please don't," she said, and looked away, and that was enough for that moment. They found lodging at a respectable boarding house on the main street, 2 rooms, propriety maintained, and the following morning they went to the courthouse and inquired about the circuit judge. His name was Elias Hargrove, and he was, as luck or something more deliberate than luck would have it, in town for a week due to an extended session on a land dispute in the next county. His clerk told them he had a 2-hour window that afternoon between proceedings. Florence presented herself and her case with a precision and authority that made the clerk, a young man of perhaps 20 who was accustomed to handling farmers and tradespeople, visibly recalibrate his expectations. She was clear about what she had, clear about what she needed, and clear about the timeline. She was given an appointment for 2 o'clock. They sat in the corridor of the courthouse and waited, and Jacob found that he was nervous in a way he had not been nervous about anything in some years, which was interesting because the stakes for Florence were considerably higher than the stakes for him in a personal sense. And yet he was nervous on her behalf in a way that felt entirely different from being nervous on his own behalf, sharper and more urgent. He sat beside her on the hard wooden bench, and at some point she said, without looking at him, "Stop fidgeting. You are making me anxious." "Sorry," he said, and stopped. And a moment later her hand moved from where it had been resting on the leather satchel in her lap and settled briefly on his forearm. Just for a second, just a brief contact of reassurance that went in both directions. And then it was gone, and she was looking straight ahead, and he was looking straight ahead, and neither of them mentioned it. Judge Elias Hargrove was a small, compact man of about 60, with a reputation in Lyon and Caldwell counties for being scrupulously fair and entirely impatient with dishonesty in any form, which was either a very good thing or a complicated thing, depending on whether your own hands were clean. And Jacob reminded himself as they sat down across from the judge that his hands were not entirely clean, but they were considerably less dirty than the hands of the men he was describing. Florence laid out the case methodically. She presented the Aldrich letter first, then the 3 corroborating documents, then her own written record of events since her return to the homestead, the dates of Aldrich's correspondence with her, the sequence of the abandonment claim filing, the evidence that the claim had been filed while she was in continuous residence. She was concise, organized, and unemotional in her presentation, not because she was not emotional, but because she had decided that this room required precision, and she was giving it that. Judge Hargrove read each document carefully and asked questions in a flat, thoughtful voice. When he turned to Jacob, Jacob told him everything, the same version he had told Florence, the honest version including the parts about his own involvement in the cattle operation. Hargrove listened to all of it without expression and then looked at him for a long moment. "You understand," the judge said, "that what you are describing implicates you in the movement of stolen livestock across county lines." "Yes, sir," Jacob said. "And you are presenting this testimony voluntarily." "Yes, sir." Hargrove tapped his finger on the desk. "The Aldrich matter is within my jurisdiction to address immediately," he said. "I am issuing a stay of the Garner abandonment claim pending investigation, effective today." He wrote something and signed it and handed the document to Florence, who took it with steady hands. "As for Mr. Briggs, his whereabouts in Texas are outside my immediate reach, but I am writing to the federal marshal's office today. The cattle operation documents will be forwarded to that office for their review." He looked at Jacob again. "Your cooperation and voluntary testimony will be noted in my communication and will be a factor in how that office approaches your role in the matter. I cannot promise you immunity, but I can tell you that a man who comes forward freely is treated differently than a man who is found." Jacob nodded. "That is fair." They left the courthouse into an afternoon that was warm and golden and full of the particular relief of having done something irreversible and right. Florence stood on the courthouse steps with the stay order in her hands and looked at it for a moment, and then looked up at the sky and breathed. And Jacob stood beside her and looked at the side of her face and thought that he could look at the side of her face for a considerable portion of his remaining life without getting tired of it. "It worked," she said. "You worked," he said. She looked at him. "We worked," she corrected, and the correction was so simple and so deliberately inclusive that it did something to the space between them, narrowed it, made it something different from the space between 2 people traveling together, and made it the space between 2 people who have decided, consciously or not, to use a word like we. That evening they ate dinner at a proper restaurant, the kind of place with tablecloths and printed menus, which felt slightly absurd given the past 3 weeks of campfires and tin bowls of beans. And Florence wore a dress she had packed in her saddlebag for this purpose. A dark green dress with a small amount of white lace at the collar that turned out to be somewhat more than traveling clothes and somewhat less than a formal occasion, and precisely right for a restaurant dinner after a courthouse victory in Emporia, Kansas in September of 1878. Jacob had cleaned up as well as a man can clean up when he has been on the plains for most of the past month, and he wore his better shirt and left his gun in his room at the boarding house and sat across the table from Florence Garner in the warm lamplight of the Emporia restaurant and thought about arithmetic. "What is on your mind?" she asked. "Your father's idea," he said. "The arithmetic of virtue. What about it?" "I have been thinking that he might have been right in a way that was broader than he knew," Jacob said. "Not that the right thing always produces the right outcome immediately, but that it produces the possibility of the right outcome, like this afternoon. None of this would have been possible if you had not come back to that homestead. If you had stayed in Wichita and let Briggs take the land, there would have been nothing to fight with. You coming back was the thing that made everything else possible." Florence looked at him across the table with an expression he could not entirely read, something that was complex and layered, and that he thought had multiple things moving through it simultaneously, warmth and something guarded and something else behind the guarded thing that was warmer still. "And what was your part in the arithmetic?" she asked. "I rode 3 days to do the wrong thing," he said, "and the fact that you were there stopped me. So I suppose I am an example of the arithmetic working in a sideways direction." She was quiet for a moment. She turned her wine glass, a small careful motion, and watched the lamplight move in it. "I am glad you rode those 3 days," she said at last. "I am glad you knocked on that door. I have been here alone for 8 months, and I had begun to think that being alone was simply the condition of the life I was living, and that I should make my peace with it." She looked up at him. "I do not want to make my peace with it any more." The restaurant was quiet around them, just the sound of other conversations at other tables, indistinct and human, and the clink of silverware and the ordinary warmth of a room full of people eating dinner. And Jacob Lawson looked at Florence Garner across the tablecloth and said, as simply as he knew how, "You do not have to." On the way back to Caldwell County, they did not take the direct route. They went a half-day's ride out of the way to pass through the town of Cedar Vale, because Florence wanted to see whether the wildflowers there were still in bloom, which seemed to Jacob like an excellent reason to go 40 miles out of the way. And they were. The roadsides full of the last goldenrod and the late asters, purple and gold against the beginning of the autumn grass. And they stopped their horses on the road and looked at it for a while in a companionable silence that was full of something neither of them was yet saying, but both of them were thinking. He told her he loved her on the last evening before they reached the homestead, as they were sitting beside a fire on the plains, with the stars enormous overhead and Cassius standing peacefully at the edge of the firelight. He told her the way he tried to tell most things, directly and without decoration, because he was not a man for elaborate speeches, and he did not think Florence was a woman for elaborate speeches, and because the stars and the fire and the quality of the night seemed to require a kind of honesty that did not need adornment. "I love you," he said. "I have been finding that out over the past 3 weeks, and I wanted to say it plainly because I think you deserve plain things." She looked at the fire for a long moment. He let her look. He was not in a hurry, or rather he was, but he understood that some kinds of hurry are exactly wrong. "I am not an easy person to love," she said at last. "I am aware of that," he said. "I am stubborn and I have opinions, and I am going to fight for that homestead for the rest of my life, and there will be seasons when that is all I have energy for." "I know," he said, "and you have a complicated legal situation that is not yet resolved, and I do not know what comes next for you." "That is also true," he said. She turned from the fire and looked at him, and the firelight was in her eyes and her hair had come half down from its pins again the way it always did by evening, and there was a streak of dust along her jaw from the day's riding, and she looked exactly like herself, which was exactly what he wanted. "I love you too," she said. "I have been finding that out for the same 3 weeks. I wanted you to say it first so that I could be sure I was not simply grateful. Are you sure?" He asked. "Yes," she said. "Gratitude feels different. This feels like something I would not be able to stop even if I tried, which I considered, because you are also complicated and also stubborn, and you have a very self-aware relationship with your own moral failures that is either admirable or exhausting depending on the moment." He smiled. She smiled back, and it was the full smile, the open one, and it was even better at close range beside a fire under the Kansas stars than it had been the first time he saw it. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat beside the fire until it burned low, and the coyotes began their late evening conversation somewhere in the darkness, and the stars wheeled their slow round above the plains. They arrived back at the Garner homestead on the following afternoon, and the house looked the way it had looked the night Jacob had first arrived, small and solid against the enormous sky, smoke rising from the chimney. Except now Florence's mother's roses, the ones she had mentioned that were coming back wild on the east side, were catching the last of the afternoon light, their hips gone red with autumn, and the fence Jacob had repaired stood straight along the north side of the property, and the well had water in it, and the lean-to kitchen roof was solid. Florence dismounted at the gate and stood for a moment looking at the house, the way she had looked at it the first time Jacob had seen her stand at the window, with the expression of someone who has decided what something is for and has committed to that decision absolutely. Then she looked at him. "Come inside," she said. "I will put coffee on." He put the horses in the barn and came inside, and she put coffee on, and they sat at the table that still bore the faint ring marks from the crate of documents, which was now mostly empty in the corner, its contents either in a courthouse in Emporia or in transit to a lawyer in Wichita. The house was quiet and warm, and the late afternoon light came through the small window and lay across the floor in a long gold rectangle. "What will you do now?" Florence asked. "About your legal situation." "Wait for the marshal's office to contact me," he said. "Present myself honestly when they do, cooperate fully. What the judge said is right. It is better to come forward than to be found." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I may owe a fine, I may have to serve some time, I do not know yet." "If you have to leave," she said, "will you come back?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Without question, if you are here I am coming back." She nodded, and it was a small nod but a solid one, the kind that does not need to be large because it is certain. "Then we will deal with it when it comes," she said. "In the meantime, there is a fence post on the south side that is listing badly, and the root cellar needs to be aired out before winter." "Practical as ever," he said. "It is a virtue," she said. He fixed the fence post and she aired out the root cellar, and in the evening they sat on the front step of the homestead and watched the sun go down over the Kansas plains, and the sky turned through every shade it had, and the grass moved in the evening wind, and the coyote started up somewhere west, and Florence leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat like that until the stars came fully out and the night was complete around them. Samuel Pryor, the lawyer in Wichita, arrived 2 weeks later in a rented buggy with a briefcase full of paperwork and the competent expression of a man who has received some very interesting letters. He was a wiry man of about 50 with spectacles and a precise gray beard, and he shook Jacob's hand without commentary on the circumstances, and sat down at the kitchen table, and went to work. What followed over the next several days was a practical and sometimes tedious process of legal clarification that Florence navigated with Pryor's guidance, and Jacob watched with a growing appreciation for the complexity of property law in 1878 Kansas. The stay order from Judge Hargrove held. The investigation of Thomas Aldrich proceeded, and within a month He had been suspended from his position at the land office pending a review that everyone involved expected to result in his removal. The Garner homestead was formally confirmed in Florence's name by the county land office under new administration. Harlan Briggs was eventually located in Texas, in a border town near the Rio Grande, and arrested by federal marshals in the spring of 1879. Jacob's voluntary testimony, documented by Judge Hargrove and forwarded to the federal marshal's office in Dodge City, was treated as significant mitigation. He paid a substantial fine, representing the wages he had received from Briggs, and was placed on a supervised probation that kept him in Caldwell County for 12 months. He found this requirement easier to comply with than almost any other obligation he had ever been given. They were married in December of 1878 in the small white church in Morrow, on a cold, clear day when the plains were dusted with the first snow of the season, and the sky was that particular pale blue that winter makes in Kansas, clean and cold and brilliant. Florence wore her best dress, which was not the green one, but a dress her mother sent from Wichita, a deep ivory with small buttons down the front that had apparently been kept in a cedar chest for an occasion. Jacob wore his cleanest clothes and his best hat and stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him down the aisle and felt the weight of the arithmetic all the way through. Gerhardt Schell and his wife attended. A few neighbors from the surrounding farms came. Florence's mother, a small, determined woman named Martha who had her daughter's eyes and her daughter's way of looking at you as if she was doing calculations, came from Wichita on the stage and hugged Florence for a long time when she arrived and then shook Jacob's hand firmly and told him she expected him to be worth the trouble. He told her he intended to be. She seemed to find this acceptable. Samuel Pryor sent a letter of congratulations. Judge Hargrove sent a brief note on courthouse stationery. Even the young clerk at the county land office, under its new administration, sent a formal document recording Florence's legal ownership of the Garner homestead in both their names now, Florence Lawson, née Garner, and Jacob Lawson, husband. The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that tests whether what a person felt in the large, dramatic moments of their life survives contact with ordinary days, and it did. The ordinary days were good. Florence's kitchen garden expanded in the spring and produced more than they could eat, and she made arrangements to sell the surplus at the general store in Morrow. Jacob found work as a hand on a neighboring ranch in the mornings and spent his afternoons improving the homestead, a new barn, a bigger root cellar, the beginning of a second room added to the house for reasons that were at the time theoretical, but were becoming less theoretical as the months passed. Florence continued to read her legal texts. She had begun corresponding with Samuel Pryor about a particular interest that had developed out of her own experience. The frequency with which women who had been widowed or left alone on homestead properties were subjected to exactly the kind of predatory land claiming that Harlan Briggs had tried to visit on her. Pryor found her analysis sharp and her suggestions practical, and he told her so. She told him she was glad to hear it and asked him to recommend a reading list. Jacob read some of the books too. He found land law less interesting than she did, but more interesting than he had expected. And he found that the discussions they had about it over the kitchen table in the evenings were among the best conversations of his life, the kind where two people are genuinely thinking together, and something gets worked out that neither could have reached alone. In the autumn of 1879, almost exactly a year after Jacob had ridden onto the Garner property with a tin of kerosene and a different kind of intention, Florence told him she was expecting a child. She told him at the kitchen table, over coffee in the morning, with the matter-of-fact directness that was entirely characteristic of her, and Jacob sat for a moment with his coffee cup suspended halfway to his mouth, and then set it down carefully and looked at her and said nothing for a moment because the feeling was too large for immediate speech. "Well," she said, "I am attempting to convey an emotion without becoming undignified," he said. She looked at him across the table with her brown eyes warm and her mouth doing the near neighbor of a smile thing and said, "You are allowed to be undignified about this." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her hand over and held his, and the morning light came through the window the way it always did, clean and gold and level, the particular light of the Kansas plains that shows things as they are. Their son was born in May of 1880, a strong, loud, thoroughly emphatic arrival who announced himself with a vigor that suggested he had opinions about the world and intended to express them. Florence's mother came from Wichita to help and stayed for 3 weeks, and was wonderful and occasionally exhausting in the way that very competent mothers can be when they are in close proximity to the raising of a grandchild. Jacob worked outside a great deal during that period, which Martha seemed to understand was not avoidance, but simply the way men process large emotions in the 19th century. They named him Silas, for Florence's father. When Jacob held the baby for the first time in the room where Florence had been born and her father had died, and where he himself had slept on the floor the first night he arrived, because the barn had been too cold, and Florence had relented and told him to sleep inside, he felt the arithmetic complete itself into something whole, and settled that he had not known was possible to feel. Silas Lawson grew up on the plains of Caldwell County, and he was not an easy child in the sense that easy children exist, but he was a genuinely interesting one, curious and determined in ways that clearly drew from both his parents. He learned to ride early and to read early, and to argue with both parents simultaneously about whatever was at hand, which they separately found either amusing or exhausting depending on the day, and later agreed was both simultaneously. By 1882, the homestead had expanded into something that could be called a proper farm rather than a homestead. Jacob had acquired a small herd of cattle, legitimate ones, purchased at fair prices from a rancher in the next county who had known him by reputation and approved of what he heard. The additional room that had been added to the house was now a proper bedroom, and there were plans, discussed over many evenings and sketched on the back of old envelopes, for a further addition to the south end of the house when the second child came, which Florence had announced in March with the same matter-of-fact morning coffee directness she had employed with the first. The second child, born in October of 1882, was a girl. They named her Clara. She was smaller than Silas had been and considerably quieter for the first several months, observing the world from wherever she was put with a wide-eyed attention that her father found very familiar, as if she were doing calculations, and her mother found both flattering and slightly unnerving for the same reason. Silas, who was 2.5 by this point, and had opinions about the baby that shifted daily between fascinated proprietorship and marked indifference, eventually settled into a position of benevolent authority over Clara that she accepted for approximately the first 2 years of her life, before developing sufficient independence to render it irrelevant. Florence's work with Samuel Pryor had developed by this time into something that functioned, informally, as legal consultation. Pryor would send her cases from his Wichita practice involving homestead property rights and women's land ownership, and she would write detailed analyses that he would then develop into legal arguments. He paid her for this work at a modest rate that she used partly for household expenses and partly for more books, which Jacob built shelves for in the expanded south room until the shelves were full, and then built more shelves. "You are going to turn this into a law office," he told her one evening, surveying the shelves. "I am going to turn it into a library," she said. "Silas will need books, Clara will need books, and you need books." "I am always in need of books," she said serenely, and handed him another stack to shelve. He shelved them. He had become very good at building things. The farm showed it. The straight fences and solid structures, and the barn that Gerhardt Schell had admired, and which Jacob had built with Gerhardt's help over the course of 2 weekends in 1881, a genuine collaboration that had produced a genuine friendship of the particular, quiet, practical kind that develops between men who work well together and do not require constant conversation. The matter of his legal history had been fully resolved by 1881. His probation had ended, his fine had been paid, and the federal marshal's office in Dodge City had closed his file with a notation of cooperation that satisfied whatever the official record required. Harlan Briggs had been convicted in Texas in 1880 and sentenced to 3 years in a federal prison, a sentence that Jacob heard about through Pryor's letters and received with a feeling that was not satisfaction, but was something close to completion, the closing of a book that had needed to be closed for a long time. Thomas Aldrich had been removed from his position at the Caldwell County Land Office and had relocated to another county. Whether in shame or simply in search of less scrutiny, nobody seemed to know, and Jacob did not spend energy wondering. The land office in Morrow was administered now by a man named Webb Foster, who had a reputation for straightforwardness and who had processed several property matters for Florence over the years without incident. On a September evening in 1883, 5 years almost to the month from the night Jacob had ridden onto the Garner property with the wrong kind of intention, he and Florence sat on the front step of the homestead the way they sometimes did in the evenings when the children were in bed, and the work was done, and the Kansas sky was doing what it does in September, turning through its full range of expression before settling into the deep particular blue of late evening. Silas was 3.5 and asleep inside. Clara was just past a year and also asleep, which was a relatively recent development that both parents were still appreciating. The plains stretched out around them in the cooling dusk, the grass gold and the cottonwood trees along the creek line showing the first yellow of autumn, and the smell of wood smoke and dried grass was in the air, and somewhere south a coyote was announcing its opinion of the evening. Florence leaned her head against Jacob's shoulder, which she had been doing since the night on the plains before they came home from Emporia, and his arm went around her the way it did, and they sat in the silence that was full of all the things that had happened between the first time they sat like this and now. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "Arithmetic," he said. She laughed, the real one, the full one that opened her face and lasted a real length of time, and he felt it against his shoulder and looked at the side of her face and thought about a man riding 3 days across the Kansas plains in September of 1878 with a tin of kerosene and a match, and about the particular grace of a lit window in a dark prairie night, and about the way a door opens sometimes onto something entirely different from what you came for. "I rode here to burn the past," he said, "and I found you in the middle of it, still alive, still holding on to it." She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him with her brown eyes in the fading light, and they were exactly the same eyes they had been the first evening, precise and warm and doing their calculations, and what they calculated now was 5 years of mornings and evenings and good work and difficult seasons and 2 children asleep inside, and a library growing against the south wall and a farm that was solid and real and entirely their own. "I was not going to let go," she said simply. "I know," he said, "that is why I stayed." She turned back to the plains and he did too, and the sky continued its slow work of becoming night, and the stars came out the way they always did over the Kansas plains, one at a time and then all at once, filling the darkness with an extravagance of light that has nothing to do with the particular sorrows and triumphs of any individual life, but manages to feel, on the right evening, with the right person beside you, as if it might. They sat there until the night was fully made, and the coyotes had their full say, and the grass rustled in the small wind that comes up after dark on the plains, and the light in the house behind them was warm and steady, and neither of them moved to go in, because there was no hurry, because this was home, because the arithmetic had come out right. Inside, Silas slept the deep, unconcerned sleep of a boy of 3 who has no reason to be anything other than entirely at ease in the world. Clara slept in her cradle with one small fist curled beneath her chin. The books on the south wall shelves stood in their orderly rows. The kitchen table, marked with the ghost of a crate's ring, still held the stub of a candle and an empty coffee cup, and a legal text lying open to a page about property rights. The photograph of Florence's parents on the wall showed two young people full of hope at the beginning of something they could not yet see the shape of. Outside, on the front step, in the deep September night, Jacob Lawson and Florence Garner Lawson sat together under the enormous Kansas sky and breathed the same air and felt the same night around them. And the years ahead were there too, present as possibility, full as the dark above the plains. And everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to be built had been built, and the only thing left to do was live it, which they intended to do together for a very long time.